Welcome to Our Time is a Garden, a series of nature poetry workshops for women and non-binary writers of color in Scotland. Our fourth workshop was titled Queering Postcolonial Travel Writing and was co-facilitated by Churnjeet Mahn. Churnjeet Mahn is a senior lecturer and Chancellor's Fellow of English at University of Strathclyde. Her primary interest is in writing about margins and border crossings, from travel writing to accounts of migration and displacement. She began her research on British Orientalist accounts of Greece and is currently working on post-colonial queer travel writing. In 2015, she was the lead on an AHRC-funded project on creating LGBTQ spaces in a refugee organization in London. And since 2016, she has been a co-investigator on the AHRC Large Grant Creative Interruptions, which investigates creativity at cultural margins. Currently, she is principal investigator on a project exploring EDI in Scottish heritage.
So I didn't have a chance to do alternate text for all of the images, but I'm going to do that after the session and email that in if that's okay. I am going to briefly describe each slide. So the slide up right now is, like, I have so many feelings about this that it's really hard to describe it without being super biased. So we can see a horizon in the distance, a mountain landscape, and there's lots of grey clouds. The sun is presumably setting. There is a man with camping gear standing in the foreground, looking out and scanning the horizon. This is a travel ad from a group called the Transformative Travel Council. And in the center, there is text that says, "Travel like a hero." Hero is capitalized. I just want to read you something from this campaign from a Transformative Travel Council about traveling like a hero. So here's a quote. "A hero travels with heart, is fully engaged, practices resolve, and is wide open to the unknown within every journey. And when travelers do that, they can transform themselves and transform the world. Travelers are seeking to reignite their sense of wonder and are craving deeper and more fulfilling travel experiences, a fact backed up by research. As the tribe, it's our load to carry, and it's on us to rise to the occasion, guide, and support the traveler in pursuit of transformation. To do this, we must reimagine our relationship with the market, the traveler, the trip designer, and the seeker. Because of this, we at the TTC have set out to transform travel, not by adding more exotic locations, new levels of luxury, or unknown heights of extreme sport, but by amending what the traveler understands travel has to offer and thereby pursues. We want to set travelers on a course to transform the world by transforming themselves. This really isn't anything new. Humans have always traveled nomadically, curiously, and often in search of deep personal meaning. As an industry, we should look forward, call on the wisdom of those who have walked the path before us. In many ways, travelers are seeking to reconnect travel to its roots and to its power," end quote. For me, this summarizes so much of what is going on in our assumptions about travel or nature, or the way in which ideas and images about travel and nature are transmitted to us. It's transmitted to us from a perspective of a white man who is able-bodied, who is not necessarily straight, but coded with straight privilege. And that's part of what we recognize here, is that nature is feminine, waiting to be conquered and penetrated. So it's irrelevant whether he's straight. There's a straight privilege which is operating in that coding, and that he is in some way exceptional. This is a man who is unchallenged. No one lives there. Nothing else lives there apart from that which can be seen, recognized, surveyed, surveilled, catalogued, and collected by the traveler. It's romantic, and by that I mean, I'm obviously alluding to the Romantic poets who, pioneered and made popular this trope of the lone figure in landscape, communing with nature. But that personal connection to empty landscapes and promise with the connection to something that is beyond us, whether we want to call it the sublime or the picturesque, is something which is coded from a very, very particular perspective. So it's a form of whiteness which constantly erases itself or makes itself illegible for the viewer, but which is omnipresent. And I think that's what is so hard in approaching, especially travel writing about nature and thinking about queer travel writing about nature, because straightness and whiteness is so omnipresent. It's impossible to see anything beyond it. So hardwired in this perspective of this kind of like romantic connection with this empty, depopulated landscape that, because it's depopulated, only belongs to the person looking at it, is imbued a type of objectivity. So in the quote that I read, it's backed up by the idea of research, you know. So obviously this is a universal truth because research shows it, and you too can step up and be a hero if you're willing to, you know, follow this campaign. The use of the word tribe in the quote that they're using, okay, so that goes straight back to the ideas of like the love of the primitive, or the primitive becoming a space or a concept or an idea which becomes fetishized in highly consumer orientated and wealthy contexts. So the only reason this campaign can talk about a travel tribe with any kind of innocence is because of hundreds of years of particularly Northern European and North American constructions of non-white spaces as primitive, and which it has an assumption that is bound up in capitalism and ideas about good progress and wealth. The quote uses the term exotic. I mean, there's so much, you know, you're kind of like lost for words when you kind of come across these terms. But let's think about the logic. Let's take it seriously. What is this campaign trying to refer to when it's talking about exotic? So it's not here, it's somewhere else. And that is a distance that simultaneously has to be maintained and domesticated. I mean, that's the way the exotic works, right? It's like far away, but it can't be so far away that it's completely threatening. We still have to have some kind of access to it. And this idea, which comes at the end of the quote that I read out, that we've always traveled. Yeah, the production of the modern leisure industry is a byproduct of capitalism and is imbricated in colonial enterprise. So yeah, travel is tied to power. So just to read that last quote out, the end of the quote again. In many ways, travelers are seeking to reconnect travel to its roots and to its power, end quote. That's the idea of power there is so tied up with everything I've just mentioned about the exceptional white figure in the field who gets to be somewhere, who gets to travel, who gets to access, that I think that one of the things we need to think about through our session and through our writing is what we mean by power, how we redistribute power, how we reroute power away from dominant forms of writing. And when I think about travel and like the language to name who is a traveler in this context, I often think about the fact that if, for example, white folk live in India or live somewhere abroad, they're expats, but if like Indians live here, they're migrants. Like we have a very elaborated language which maps onto good types of mobility and bad types of mobility, which are tied into histories of travel. So even though travel in its very contemporary codification has been completely tied to the leisure industry, we can never think about it outside the colonial encounter and colonial context. It's just that we have a more sophisticated vocabulary for doing different kinds of sleight of hand to erase that. So I don't, in today's talk, want to think about anti-heroic ways of writing, because obviously I'm critical of the hero in this context. I want to think about the different kind of routes into thinking about what we can do in creating, making visible, unpicking this existing relationship with travel in writing, and how even just making some power relationships visible can help to seed other types of creative enterprise that unpick some of the heteronormativity and the whiteness of existing writing. So my talk today isn't a linear series of progressive points, they're more like snapshots into different issues, and then at the end I've got some questions. So slide 2. This is an image from Kew Gardens. In this slide, I want to think about curating nature. So one of the ways in which we're encouraged to think about the natural world is that it is pre-existent, that it somehow exists beyond language. But obviously the minute we're rendering it in language, it becomes loaded with like sets of ideological assumptions or perspectives that are bound to a cultural moment in a set of ideas. And what we see in the botanical gardens that were created during the Victorian period is this made visible, this ideological approach to the world, which was about collecting and cataloguing things out of context and domesticating them for and making them accessible for an audience in Britain. And this happens from plants to people. There isn't much differentiation. And so part of the challenge I want to think about is what happens when plants, people, objects, possessions become part of the circulating narrative about nature, which are tied together, which then become things to be displayed and consumed in places like Britain. And in that sense, I think one of the most radical things that we can do and think about is thinking about ourselves and our connections to this natural world and how we have been curated with it. So when I was thinking about this from a queer perspective, there were two things I was thinking about for today's talk. One was actually thinking about examples of queer travel writing. And then I was like, actually, I want to get away from identity politics and away from individuals articulating something that is queer and think about queer as a way of challenging some of the natural order that is imposed in these views of a natural world. Because in that ordering of nature comes the assumption of heterosexuality or heteronormativity, comes the assumption of whiteness. And I want to see them as imbricated processes which shape the reality of how we understand sexuality, full stop. I think there's one example I want to use to kind of make that, like, explain that more fully. So, I grew up in Glasgow. My whole life was in a city. I didn't have much contact with nature. I'm still probably slightly suspicious of nature because of that. But my mum and like all of the generations of my family before me were farmers in Punjab, in India. And so my parents had this really close relationship with nature and all this knowledge about living with the natural world from things to do with crop rotation, to working with animals in a form of subsistence farming, which was not about extracting maximum yield, which is what farming has become, especially in Punjab, but was about working with the land and with what was available to live together with the natural world. And I don't want to romanticize that too much. Like, obviously, there are still problems of resource and exploitation involved in that. But that to me was a very strange place. And when my mum would tell me stories about what life was like there and the rhythms of life, which are obviously completely tied to the temperature, like when it's hot, when it's cold, when it's going to rain, and different forms of festivals around harvest or other cycles in the year, she would talk about different types of rituals and the people involved in them. And one of the groups she told me about were hijras. So hijras are recognized as a third gender in India, have been present in Indian mythology and accounts of Indian life for thousands of years, and have been part of a social fabric. So for someone like my mum, who is illiterate, the idea that there's more than two genders was kind of completely uncontroversial. Of course, because they were there. They were part of the social fabric. They were part of the rhythms of a year. And anytime there was a marriage or a child was born, so these moments when you see an important kind of social reproduction, hijras played an important part. So the complicated way in which these stories of gender diversity tied into rituals and practices imbricated in a natural environment were told to me spoke to a world which seemed so different from the world that I was growing up in. And I think in that sense, two things that I just want to flag are: one, gender and sexual diversity has always existed in the world. So the idea that what happens if we start thinking about heterosexuality as another type of fiction, or as a story, or as a structure that we have been told is natural? What happens when we denaturalize it and say, actually, it is another social story? That actually a natural state is just diversity, that it actually, we can't walk in with assumptions about what that looks like. And for me, that's part of queering the idea of nature in the natural world. It doesn't have to be about queer identifying individuals. It's the entire structure we're using to think about nature to begin with. And then I suppose the other thing that I want to think about in terms of so gender diversity has existed is then thinking about how representations of nature and their curation as natural, which in itself is a highly artificial process, that sleight of hand erases queer and non-white presences. And to me, I suppose the reason I picked this picture of Kew Gardens, which is showing lots of different leaves and faunas in close proximity in a traditional Victorian pavilion, is that it shows that Victorian architecture for artificially pulling together all of these examples from nature, which are not necessarily in dialogue in their innate places, but have been placed in dialogue through Victorian architecture and rendered natural to us, so that we walk in and we believe and we see and we recognize it as natural. Slide 3, nature and paradise. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to embarrass myself by telling you something really, really stupid about myself. When I was little, I thought Hawaii was a synonym for paradise. I didn't actually believe it existed, because all of the associations with Hawaii was that it was like just this paradise on earth. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with with what settler colonialism has done in Hawaii and the militarization of Hawaii and what that's done to communities who who are there to be part of a service industry, so that other people can come and consume this idea of paradise in nature, and they have to perform their local, primitive, novel rituals for the entertainment of wealthy Western tourists who come for their 2-week vacation in the summer. I mean, the power imbalance there, I mean, is hardwired into the operation of modern tourism. But here I just want to ask those questions that we should always be asking, like, who makes paradise or produces the idea of paradise? Whose paradise is it? Who lives in paradise? Who works in paradise? And I suppose, especially when in terms of juxtaposing these two images, one of the things that I was thinking about was surveillance culture and border monitoring, especially in terms of visas and passports and who gets to travel. And I suppose that's a fundamental question that we keep needing to go back to, because the person in the first slide that I showed you on the side of the mountain, part of a coded assumption there is also he can be anywhere in the world, but not everybody has that right or that access. And actually, queer people of color are some of the people who struggle the most when it comes to crossing borders, being in relationships or kinship structures which are legible to the state and which can be rewarded with the documents you need to cross a border. This is a slide which shows a collection at Edinburgh of a series of human skulls collected by a phrenology society in the 19th century, and which is, I think, still held in the Anatomy Museum. There are lots of human remains which are collected as curios, as research objects, as collectibles in British institutions. And I want to juxtapose this with what I was saying about Kew Gardens, to just think for a moment about the ways in which people and plants and objects have all been lumped together into material artifacts that can be used to bolster white supremacy or justify white supremacy. That material from across the world can be collected and arranged into a pseudoscience, and it's that curation, that production of the idea of natural order, which I obviously want to be critical of here, because part of what phrenology did, and it's now completely discredited pseudoscience, was use skull shapes to justify why especially Northern European people were the rightful heirs of the world and of all power, because they had the closest proximity to Greek statues, or ancient Greek statues, and statues from ancient Rome. So if Enlightenment philosophy said, and by the way, the greatest achievements in human civilization were from Periclean Athens and from ancient Rome, They were like, and by the way, we look the most like them. Therefore, we must be also the people who are part of the pinnacle of Western civilization. And here is the material evidence for why everyone else isn't. And I think that, I suppose in many ways, I am worried about the fact that there's so much contemporary science which happens, or so much contemporary scientific knowledge, especially in biology and chemistry and other disciplines, which has literally been made from the exploitation of people of color, which is not acknowledged, which is not written about, which is not understood. Our very understanding of nature and of biology has come from the exploitation of people of color. What does that mean, and how do we think about forms of restitution, of acknowledgement, of holding what that means? And there's been recent research on, like, say, for example, the number of people of color who win grants from the Wellcome Trust or other big funders of biological and other natural science research. And it's still, Black people and people of color are still way underrepresented in that grant capture. So to me, that history of racism persists in the present. It still persists in the present in terms of who gets to work on ideas of nature and that intersection, especially between nature and science, because still for us that's seen as the most objective truth about the natural world. People and collecting, the most obvious example of that to show you is, this example is from the British Empire exhibition in 1924, where there's many empire exhibitions. It's really easy to find information about them and information about human zoos. The reason I picked this one to briefly touch on is obviously because Wembley is where there's a humongous South Asian diaspora now. I think it's really interesting to think about this highly curated racist space later becoming a space of racialized resistance to the state and what that might mean. So here on the left, we see a postcard from the Empire exhibition in 1924. It says the Sierra Leone village. There's a group of figures standing in the foreground, and we see straw huts. On the right, there is a poster from the British Empire exhibition, which shows an illustration of what was the walled city of West Africa. Various walls, straw hut in the background, in the foreground, and some figures, and the perimeter is covered with various maps from across the empire. The collection and curation of live people taken out of context and put together for the consumption of British audiences is, I think, something we continue to see in our representation of other places. I think it's really easy. I mean, I've showed images like this to my students and they're horrified. I don't think it's a million miles away from what the tourist industry does today when it sells us other places or exotic places. And so in terms of that, I think we have to think about how the representation of the exotic or difference now is always tied to these moments of collection and curation of the natural world, and the natural world as being something that is understood, written about, collected, disciplined by people in the colonial centre. Another thing I wanted to think about very briefly was like rerouting or renaming or rewriting our ideas about places. One of my earliest experiences in India was really weird because I had never left Scotland, and then I was in this place where I was like looking at a map, and there were these place names like Dalhousie and MacLeodgunge, and I was like, who are these Scottish dudes that have ended up in the foothills of the Himalayas? And we still live with a legacy of names and their transposition or translation into English. And I think that then gives us, and this is not a question I have an answer to. I really hope you have an answer to it, or ways of thinking about it. If English has been a language which has held all of this problematic work, right, of rewriting places, of doing all of this cataloging and curating work, and is constantly inscribed with racist assumptions, with things like the exotic, etc. Is it more powerful to write against or rework those in English, or do we multiply language, or do we turn our back to English? And then if we multiply languages, how do we put them in dialogue together? Is it just juxtaposition, or do they interface in some way? Can they unmake each other? How do we think about language and power in those settings? And I have really, I know this is something that comes up all the time, because obviously there are lots of English texts where you will have like other languages put in, but like I always feel the hierarchy there is that it's in English and there's another language. So the other language, which is invariably in italics or is marked out different in some way, becomes the kind of the different thing. Is there a way that we flip that, or is English just too problematic? And then what do we do in terms of like reach even? Who do we want to talk to or reach with these words? What kind of power do they enact? And I put these road markers up. So these are road markers in Scotland, which have a Gaelic and English together. To think about that, because I'm sure many of us have seen that, right? And what power does that enact on us? Is it important for us to see the Gaelic, even if we can't read it or understand it? Or does it not make a difference? Are we always going to look at that and read it through English? I am going to stop soon, I promise. So this one, this slide, on the left, we have, I know it's maybe strange to call them cute, but I kind of think Tasmanian devils are cute. We have Tasmanian devils, and on the right, we have a lizard, which is now extinct in Jamaica. The reason I wanted to put these two images up was to think about the ways in which part of what we see in the colonial enterprise and through capitalism is the endangerment of the natural world. So let me just dwell on the lizard very briefly. I like this poster because it's like it's an ironic poster. It pretends to be a vintage travel poster, but it's pointing out what tourism and travel has done to the natural world. So this lizard became a problem in the 19th century to various forms of plantation and to sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And what people did was transport a mongoose from India, who then ate all of the lizards, and they basically disappeared from view. So you could see there that there were different parts, different locations were being exploited and different types of natural environment being brought into conversation to create these destructive routes. So just flagging up that point about what makes this queer there is a huge amount of writing in the 19th century about why queer lives are unnatural. And I think I want to just read them as part of a vast repository of language which talks about what is good nature and what is bad nature and what you do with it. I'm not going to read out this quote, but I'll make the slides available later. It's from Richard Burton, and he thinks about what some of the queerest places in the world are, and primarily the Middle East, North India, China, Southeast Asia. And he sees them as a deviation from nature or something broken that needs to be fixed. So we can see that these interventions in the natural world during the period of colonialism have all kinds of consequences that we still live with today. And then my final point is just about thinking about the ways in which different writers, so I've got some book covers up by Octavia Butler, have used aspects of nature. So one of the things we see here are through the use of science fiction, Butler riffs on ideas about like empathy and biological exchange, especially through vampirism. She uses biology and ideas about nature to critically unpick these racist legacies, but by doing it in a fantastical environment, she can suspend some of the rules of realism in our world to create a speculative environment, which I think opens up questions about, again, about what we need to leave behind in order to imagine differently or to write differently. And yeah, the opportunity of non-realistic or non-realist environments. So in terms of like those challenges for us, when we're thinking about doing this kind of writing, I suppose it's like not thinking about being anti-heroes, because anti-heroes are still in a relationship with the hero. I think that ends up being a weird binary. Like we need to think about other ways of being in the environment. Embodied connections of the world around us where we are part of an imbricated and codependent ecology, not someone or something that stands above or beyond it. How do we write without owning something, without disciplining nature? And because the moment we do that, we make assumptions about what's natural, from race to sexuality. What happens when we suspend the natural order of white supremacy and heteronormativity in writing? Like what's even the work we have to do to get to that place? And what language or techniques can we use to make visible destructive chains of power? And I think in that, it is denaturalizing some of these images that we have been transmitted to us as being natural. And you see that in various writing, from either making nature seem sinister or changing relationships with it or doing something with it to denaturalize it in some way. But I will finish here. Thanks.